So again, my name is Patrick Lassiter. I teach AP World History in Durham, North Carolina, at a place called Research Triangle High School. Sorry if you're hearing any noise. I'm moving my mic around. And so, yeah, let's go ahead and get started. The key concept that we're going to be dealing with today is key concept 5.2. It's imperialism and nation state formation. And for this key concept, it's going to cover pretty much everything that you can do with imperialism. But it certainly overlaps with what you heard last week. If you were here with Amanda with Key Concept 5.1, that deals a lot with the Industrial Revolution. And some of the ideas of nationalism, nation-state formation really go along with the next key concept, 5.3. That one deals with the Enlightenment and revolution, but also nationalism and the creation of nation states. And certainly imperialism will even cross over with key concept 5.4, which deals with global migration. This is the only unit where we have 4 key concepts. Give a quick shout out to Gabby, one of my students who is in this chat. So welcome. So the key concept itself covers what we call the new imperialism. You may have heard it called Imperialism 2.0. One of my favorite AP World History teachers, Jonathan Henderson, teacher down in Georgia, calls it that. You may have heard it from other places. But this is kind of a second wave of imperialism, not that first wave that comes along with the discovery of the Americas and colonization of the Americas, but here's kind of a second wave of it. We also will cover in this key concept expansion of existing empires and new imperial powers coming about and rising around the world. And then we'll talk a little about resistance to imperialism. I saw a question pop up. Somebody asked about in Europe, did anybody fight imperialism? And I can definitely deal with that question when we get to resistance. So I'm going to try not to forget. And then lastly, we'll think about justifications for imperialism, although we're actually going to cover that first when we think about causes or motivations. So was this key concept tested recently? Well, yes, it's tested every year in multiple choice, but it is also a favorite for free response questions, short answer questions. In 2017, the third SAQ dealt a little bit with imperialism, and the second LEQ even had some overlap. And last year, SAQ number 2 had an image of Britain dealing with the Mughal Empire in India. And then the DBQ dealt with kind of the intersection of imperialism and railroads, with railroad building around the world. So this is something that if you know it well, you're going to really set yourself up to do well on the AP exam. I would be very much surprised if none of the free response questions, SAQ included, dealt with imperialism. This is just such a monumental thing that connects very much to the Industrial Revolution, which of course is one of the most significant changes in all of human history. And then it also connects very much with both world wars, really, World Wars I and II, especially one. It's one of those 4 main causes that you hear Teacher Jones on about. So that said, let's look at the key concept itself. As states industrialized, they also expanded existing overseas empires and established new colonies and transoceanic relationships. So here in this key concept, I've kind of got the 3 main bullet points, although there is more to it if you look at the course guide online. Industrializing powers established these transoceanic empires. So we're focusing mainly on these empires across the seas, although there is some ideas in the second point, imperialism influenced state formation and contraction around the world. So we will talk a little bit about land-based empires here and there with this. And then in some imperial societies, cultural, religious, and racial ideologies were used to justify imperialism. And one specific one here, social Darwinism, comes up. And like I said, we're going to be talking about that here on the front end. All right, so that's what we're doing. That's where we're going in the next 35 minutes or so, and then we'll play a little Kahoot that Amanda has prepared for us, save me a bunch of time, and will give us a lot to talk about. So let's get started first by defining this term imperialism, although in the poll that I had, if you haven't answered that poll, go ahead and answer it down at the bottom of your screen. Most everybody had some idea of what imperialism is, so I don't know how much good this definition is doing, how good it is for you, but nevertheless, we want to have a starting point. So I actually prefer the second definition here, this idea from Britannica that imperialism is a state government practice or advocacy of extending power and dominion, especially by direct territorial acquisition or by gaining political and economic control. And that's important because economic imperialism is something we see in this time period too, especially in Latin America. And while the bulk of this presentation won't talk about Latin America specifically, I'm going to try to give you a couple things to grasp onto. So if it's covered in your class or you come across it in your reading, you will kind of have an anchor in your mind. That's one of the keys, I think, is always having that anchor to add information to. So let's take a look at the causes and motivations of imperialism. And we'll start with the economic causes or motivations for imperialism. You might see these called justifications or what have you. But ultimately, the most significant cause or motivation for imperialism is economic. There's certainly political and cultural reasons for this, but it is the Industrial Revolution that really brings on the drive to create these massive transoceanic empires. And it makes sense, certainly, how this can happen. With industrialization, you have these factories like the cotton textile factory you see here that are producing more goods faster, more cheaply than ever before. And if you're going to be churning out these finished products, these manufactured goods, at a higher rate than ever before, then you need more input. You need more raw materials to go into this process. And if you're a little itty bitty island country like Great Britain, or even a kind of a standard European country on the main continent, you have limited resources. There's just simply put not enough stuff there that you can keep providing for these textile industries in Britain, for example. So Britain goes outside of itself. Their raw materials, they bring in cotton from India and Egypt, establishing that economic relationship. In Egypt, for example, that is going to kind of be the gateway for Britain to take control in that region. For example, or kind of going more into it, Egypt is producing cotton for Great Britain. In fact, they start producing more and more cotton as Great Britain increases their demand for it, especially because during the American Civil War, there was a kind of a lack of cotton coming into Britain. And so Egypt becomes extremely dependent on selling cotton to the British. And when cotton prices collapse, Britain basically takes the opportunity, as Egypt's in debt to them, to come in and take over. Now, that had been because Egypt was in debt for a lot of other things. For example, Britain building railroads in the region and lots of other stuff. But what we do see with these raw materials is this imperial relationship. These countries that are producing the goods and manufacturing goods, and then, manufacturing goods, and then these colonial territories which are producing the raw materials for this industrial machine. And so they become very much tied together in this new global economy, right? This new global capitalism. So raw materials, of course, are one of those main motivations, but we can't leave out the fact that there are other economic incentives for these European countries to conquer the world, so to speak, or colonize Africa or take more direct control in India. And that is to have markets to sell goods. I use the same example in my class every year, but I think it's effective. Imagine you are a manufacturer, this factory you see in front of you, and you make pants, and you're pretty darn good at making pants. You get cotton from India and you make your pants, and you are so good at making pants that everyone in Britain or everyone in your country buys your pants. Well, once everybody has your pants, then you have no one to sell pants to, unless you can convince them to buy a second pair of pants. And then you do pretty well for yourself there. Everybody needs 2 pairs of pants. It works out. It's great. But what happens after everybody has 2 pairs of pants? It's hard to convince them to buy a third or a fourth or what have you. Hopefully they might, tear and get a hole in them, but you need more people to sell pants to. That's where I'm getting to. And so you need markets to sell these goods. For Europeans, that was India. That was eventually China. It was Japan. It was these many different regions of Africa that Europe carves up. It was Latin America. These are the markets that they can have that continue to drive industrialization. So I think that's really important to understand. It's something that I really try to drive home in my classroom, is that it's not just about raw materials, but also having markets to sell your finished products. And I've talked a little while on that one, and a little long, but keep in mind, it is the single greatest motivation or cause for imperialism. All right, the next one we want to think about are political causes or motives. And so when we think about the political motives for imperialism, we have to keep in mind that there are, at the same time, nation states forming, this idea of the nation, the group of people with something in common, which share a culture, share a language, share some type of self-determination. It's that idea of nationalism really comes up in the French Revolution, and Napoleon spreads that idea across the continent. Even though he eventually is defeated in 1815, that idea of nationalism still resonates. And so bound up with these ideas of nationalism is kind of inherent competition between European countries to prove that one nation state is better than the next. And that is competing with Britain, right? Look at Britain's empire in this map in kind of the traditional red. It was a massive empire. And I think this map is from 1897, something like that. So we have this massive empire. Well, then France needs to compete with them. And Germany, who is late to form as a nation, right? In 1870 something, forms as a nation state, but still competing with Britain around the world. So one way to show off your power as a nation, to bring pride to your country, is to gobble up land, to take over new territories. And this competition is certainly the one of the drivers of imperialism. It certainly will drive the scramble for Africa in 1884 to 1900 or so. So those nationalist ideas even go outside of Europe, right? They will, in a little bit, talk about Japan. Japan has the same idea. They develop this idea of their nation and superiority over people in East Asia. And they themselves will begin their imperial expansion to get themselves on a level even with Europeans. Now, there is another political motive for this, and that is kind of goes along with competition around the world in the spirit of nationalism. That is simply getting strategic locations and taking over strategic regions of the world. So Britain, for example, in taking over the Cape Colony, winning it from the Dutch after kind of prolonged wars. The Cape Colony is an excellent refueling stop between Britain and the crown jewel of the British Empire, India. France also looked for some of these strategic locations. I forget the name of one guy I was reading the other day, who made the argument for imperialism along kind of all of these economic motives, political motives, cultural ideology. But one of the things he simply stated was that They need refueling stations. They need strategic military bases around the world if they're going to compete with other European nations. And that was one of the motivations for France trying to get land in Indochina. So those political motives are significant. And lastly are the cultural or ideological motives for imperialism. So certainly in this time, there was this idea of cultural superiority that was developing, and it was very closely tied to race. And so we see like racist ideologies develop in this time period and become very prevalent. You may have, your teacher may have had you read selections from White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. And he employs the United States to take up their white man's burden and bring forth the best ye breed. Among other things, he calls these helpless peoples that he's encouraging the United States to help, half devil, half child, right? They're not even all human, so to speak. These ideas became extremely prevalent, and Europeans began to see themselves as superior. One thing that we see in kind of the misuse of science in this time period is an idea of social Darwinism come up as a justification for imperialism. A guy named Herbert Spencer takes Darwin's theory of evolution and applies it to this kind of idea of survival of the fittest to imperialism, basically claiming that white Europeans were biologically superior to all these people they were conquering, and thus they were just in colonizing people around the world. They were just occupying their role. Completely racist, completely non-scientific, and still prevalent. The last thing that we see also, just like we think about kind of the first wave of imperialism or colonization, we often just call it, with the Spanish conquering the Americas and the British settling the New World, we think of kind of God, glory, gold, right? And that idea of God, of religion, that does not go away in this time period. So there are a lot of religious motivations, and missionary work played an important role in imperialism. It oftentimes laid the groundwork for later European incursions into certain areas. For example, missionaries would bring with them, of course, Christianity to try to convert people to Christianity, which then could form closer ties with Europe, the European homeland. But they would also bring with them medicines and education from the West. And so ultimately, what you have here is missionaries trying to do surely what they believe is right, but also you can kind of be critical of them, I think, at times, because they were trying to persuade people to give up their traditional beliefs. Sometimes this was intermixed with ideas of cultural superiority and social Darwinism, that one religion was better than the other, that one culture was better than the other. And like I said, it often helped lay groundwork for later imperialism. So some important ideas to keep in mind when we're thinking about the causes and motives for imperialism. And I'm going to take a look at the questions, just sneak a peek to see if there's anything here that I can go ahead and answer before we look any further. So one question that's got the most upvotes here is, what is the difference between imperialism and colonization? Somebody's already got an answer started here, which looks really good. Yeah, so imperialism, if you think back to that definition, we see, and I'll jump back to it. Oh, went too far. This is the policy of extending a country's power and influence. And it can be through colonization, which means basically settling in a region. So actually sending Europeans to settle territories outside of Europe. That is typically what we mean by colonization. Sometimes it is with direct governmental control. But imperialism does not have to have that. You could use military force and not have people there or settling there. You could have economic control of an area. For example, I knew I was going to get to this too early, but a company like the United Fruit Company, an American corporation, which was so powerful in developing monopolies over fruit production in Central America, basically could dictate to governments there what they should do. They basically had governments create favorable policies for the United Fruit Company. Ultimately, I would say imperialism includes a little bit more than just colonization, though we tend to separate it out, maybe use different names for colonization in the aftermath of Columbus's arrival in the Americas up until about the American Revolution, and then this idea of imperialism, which really comes up in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. So hopefully I answered that question. Really good one. Yeah, let's see. The others only have like one vote apiece. There is a really good question here. Was there anyone who fought imperialism? I'm not going to forget that question. I'm going to keep remembering it, and I'm going to come back to it in a little bit. All right, so the next thing we want to think about is how these countries established their transoceanic empires. And we're going to talk about 4 different things here. I'm going to try to move a little bit more quickly, however. So the first thing that we see is that some states in this time period, some of these empires, succeed in strengthening their control over territories. So one place we see this particularly is in India. Now, Britain had had a presence in India for quite some time, since the early 1700s, maybe even late 1600s, I believe. But in the 1700s, they kind of get a major victory by beating France in a worldwide war, the 7 Years' War. We called it in the United States the French and Indian War, or what would become the United States. In kicking France out, Britain gets kind of a stranglehold over trade in India. And this is done through this corporation, this joint stock company that had a monopoly on trade in India. It was called the British East India Company. Now, the British East India Company basically takes advantage of weakening Mughal rule in India and takes advantage of conflicts within kind of the remaining Mughal territories between princes, and uses that as leverage to gain more and more control of trade in India. They begin to make sure they get raw materials. They begin to sell their wares. They have governmental control over a large area. And in fact, at this time, we're talking early 1800s here, the British East India Company even had its own military to carry out the British will. Now, this was not direct control of India. The British Crown, the British Parliament, back in half a world away, back in their country, they were unable, mainly because of the slow communication back and forth from India back to Britain, to really have a centralized control of this region. And so they allowed the British East India Company to control it. However, in 1857, a rebellion breaks out among soldiers of this British East India Company. Now, a majority of soldiers in this British East India Company were actually Indian. They were indigenous peoples, both Hindu and Muslim. And for a number of reasons, one of the more famous being the belief or the idea that the British had been greasing rifle cartridges with pig and cow grease fat. The sepoys, as they were known, these soldiers who were in the British East India Army, they rebel, basically killing important members of the British East India Company, important British diplomats in the region. Eventually, Britain sends in their military and puts down this rebellion. The British refer to it as the Sepoy Rebellion or Sepoy Mutiny, but in that kind of, it's referred to in India as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and it's seen as kind of this nationalist thing to get behind that starts uniting India together. But you can kind of see the different points of view: a Sepoy Mutiny or rebellion versus an Indian kind of rebellion for independence. It's two very different connotations. Nevertheless, Britain sends in their military, crushes this rebellion in a quite brutal, in quite a brutal way. I think something, if you count like deaths and starvation, it's something like 800,000 or up to 800,000 people die in this short war. But Britain, by that point, realizes that they need to take more direct control, that the British East India Company is not up to the challenge, so to speak. And they use the technologies of the Industrial Revolution, the idea that you're going to have more and more steamships being built. They lay telegraph wires, Britain more directly with India, and thus taking a greater, more direct role in government of the region. And we refer to this time period of British control from about 1857, 58 until Indian independence as the British Raj, or the British reign in India. So this is the British Raj government that has direct control over this massive territory, massive and productive territory. The British, in strengthening their control, build railroads throughout the country. They establish governments. They set up systems of education in the region. Kind of ironically, the connection of these diverse regions of India via railroad, via the creation of a common language in English being used in India, and Western style education. Those will actually be the things that unite India together and eventually helps India push for independence from England, ending colonial rule there, but not until the 1940s. This same basic pattern that we see in British India is found elsewhere. I'm not going to go too much into it right now just for sake of time, because I droned on about the last thing, but the Netherlands do something similar in Indonesia, where the Dutch East India Company was in charge. So that's, if you want to take a look in your books or ask your teacher, that might be something to get a little bit more info on. Now, another thing that we see in the establishment of these transoceanic empires, and the thing that usually sticks in a lot of people's minds when thinking about the age of imperialism, or this new imperialism, is the Scramble for Africa. And the Scramble for Africa is probably the most noteworthy event of the time period. I think if you had to rank them, this would be the one that would stick in your minds. The Scramble for Africa is kicked off when the Belgians start making incursions into the Congo. And Europeans, understanding as we get kind of closer to 1880, understanding that war could break out. I mean, the British in South Africa had fought wars against Dutch settlers there. They had fought wars against the Zulu kingdom. Europeans realized that if they needed to keep a balance of power somehow. And you couldn't have Britain competing with France, competing with Belgium, competing with the Netherlands, competing with this newly formed country of Germany. It just would not go well. You would end up with war, which they get inevitably anyway in World War I, but they want to stay that off for a while. And so in 1884, the Conference of Berlin, or the Berlin Conference, is called by Otto von Bismarck, and European countries send these leaders to Berlin to talk about how Africa will be open to colonization. And they basically set up a number of ground rules. They acknowledge that the Belgians have staked their claim to the Congo and to the vast resources of rubber there, which, of course, the Belgians of course, absolutely are destructive in their colonization of the Congo. You may have talked about it in your class. You may have read King Leopold's Ghost, which is like brutal treatment of Africans of the Congo. But anyways, their claim to the Congo is acknowledged, and they set up basically rules for European countries to colonize Africa. You have to state your intention to the rest of Europe, and then you have to go and you have to actually make your presence known or felt in that region. And if you can do both those things, European countries agreed to respect each other's claims in Africa. The group not represented at this Berlin conference, Africans themselves, who had no say in this. So what we see here is, as these empires are established in Africa, is this combination of diplomacy, of imperialism through diplomacy, and imperialism through warfare. I told, as I gave you an example, Britain fighting wars against the Zulu. There were other examples too. Ethiopia manages to hold off imperialism. Ethiopia and Liberia are the only two places in Africa that avoid being colonized. Liberia, because it was a protectorate of the United States, and Ethiopia, because it had modernized somewhat and was able to hold off Europeans, at least until the Italians in the build-up to World War II. So we see these European powers growing. Certainly in Africa, we see that. The French and the British take massive amounts of land. The Germans a little bit further behind. The Portuguese have some early claims in there, but it is noteworthy to say that Portugal and Spain, in terms of imperial powers, they are weakening in this time period. They're declining. Of course, Spain had a number of problems with Napoleon invading, and then followed by losing their colonies in the Latin American revolutions. Portugal is fading as well, as they're basically squeezed out of Indian Ocean trade by the British and Dutch. All right. Next thing I want to talk about, one thing that we see in establishing transoceanic empires, is that some countries have success in setting up these settler colonies. And this is where we might think of that term colonization a little bit more. There's a couple of these to know. One, the British in South Africa, which I've talked a little bit about. South Africa was originally settled by the Dutch, and was an important Dutch colony, important refueling station. But eventually, after a series of wars, Britain takes over the Cape Colony that becomes known as South Africa. Not only do the British have to fight indigenous Black Africans in the region, they also fight these Dutch colonists who had been there for generations. They became known as Boers, B-O-E-R-S, or the Afrikaners. And initially, Britain forces the Boers out of kind of these fertile lands inland. What's called the Great Trek, where they move eastward. I think it's around the I should give you a date here. I think it's around like 1830-ish. I can't remember. Well, nevertheless, you can look it up. But they force these Dutch settlers east, and are perfectly fine with them kind of living off on their own until diamonds and gold are discovered in Boer lands. And that sets off a series of wars that are called the Boer Wars between Britain and these Dutch settlers in the 1880s and 1890s. So you have these British settlers of South Africa fighting with previous white settlers of South Africa, as well as the Black Africans themselves, including the Zulu kingdom and the Xhosa peoples in the region. What eventually results is Britain reaching kind of a peace with the Boers by setting up a hierarchical system of preference in the region, where white South Africans are given preferential treatment over Black South Africans, really setting up the modern day, or what will become in the next time period, the system of apartheid. But the British do settle elsewhere. The one that everybody always likes to talk about is Australia. The British settle Australia and New Zealand, first with convicts, using it as a convict colony. And then later, when gold is discovered in the region, more British settlers come into that territory. There's a lot in Key Concept 5.4 that deals with this migration, as well as policies limiting migration from non-white countries. There's the White Australia policy that's put in place to make sure that only whites settle in the region, thus limiting Asian migration into Australia. So that's for a different session, however, but it's important to know. And then the last thing I want to think about with colonization and establishment of these transoceanic empires is this kind of new colonialism, neo-colonialism, it's often said, that is found in Asia and Latin America. This is not necessarily direct settlement or direct control over a government, but often economic control of regions. We see this with European powers in Asia. I'm going to talk about China and Japan in a moment, and then especially in Latin America. And this was seen especially with the British and the United States in Latin America, this economic control that they had over the region. Even though they were not technically running governments in the area, the economic power of American and British multinational corporations was enough to kind of dictate what those countries would do and make sure there were favorable policies for these imperial powers. All right, let's take a look at a couple questions, and then I will move on a little bit more. We have one that's upvoted a lot. Did anyone fight imperialism during this time? That's the one I still want to get to. I'm glad I did not forget it. So yes, I'll just answer it now because otherwise I might run long. There were people who pushed back against imperialism. You have these nationalists in Europe looking to grow industry, grow their reach around the world. And there were people who pushed back against imperialism, most notably Marxists and socialists, some people who were opposed to this capitalism. There was one guy I was reading about earlier. I want to say Hobart might be his name. I'm going to look it up real quick. But make sure I can get his name right. Hobson, that's it. John Hobson, who was a strongly influenced anti-imperialism for both Marxists and liberals worldwide. And so there were people who were kind of pointing out this kind of folly of national pride, this the inequality that capitalism not only led to within European countries, but around the world. And so there were people who pushed back against it. But this movement was just so great and driven so much by this rise of industrialization that it was going to be really hard to win out. All right. So let's take a look. I want to think now about some of the reactions to imperialism. And I want to start with the cases of China and Japan, and then I can move very quickly through the rest of this, and then we will Kahoot very shortly in a few minutes, hopefully. So the age of imperialism, and this is something I think that is ripe for a question, especially multiple choice question. I'm sure you'll get something on this. And that is comparing imperialism and the responses to imperialism in two East Asian nations, that is China and Japan. And basically, imperialism spells trouble for China. And that is because China, like Japan, had self-imposed isolation. And a lot of European countries, in buying goods from China, were not selling things to China. And so the British find out that there is one thing that people in China will buy, and that's because it is highly addictive and highly destructive, and that is the drug of opium. It's also a drug that was grown in India, which was a British holding, and could easily be shipped into China. You can actually see on this chart here, beginning in the late 1700s and into the 1900s, that opium becomes a major export or a major item that is imported into China all the way until 1880. And this is kind of the key for Britain to even out that trade imbalance. And it will be the catalyst for wars between Britain and China, and ultimately open China up to trade with the rest of the world. But we have something very different in the case for Japan. Westerners, the United States, rolls up in our boats with guns and tells Japan to stop being closed. And they, unlike China, agree. So I want to think about this, and I just created a really quick chart on this earlier, which feel free to write down yourself or take a look or a screenshot of. But before kind of this age of imperialism, China and Japan are basically in the same in the same boat. They had self-imposed isolation. Trade was limited by the government. In China, it was limited to the port city of Canton, and European traders had to trade with government-approved and licensed dealers. In Japan, trade was limited basically to the port city of Nagasaki, and they only really traded with the Dutch, and they had limited trade with other places in East Asia, but very much limited their trade with Europe. And both of these imposed this isolation because they were worried about European incursion. They both were very wary of the spread of Christianity in their territories, and they were very wary of kind of losing their traditions. And so they both self-impose this isolation. That happens in our last time period. But they also face imperial confrontation in this time period. For China, it's the British selling opium and these European powers kind of quote unquote at their door. For Japan, it occurs in 53 or 54 when Commodore Matthew Perry, 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry comes up, delivers a letter to Japan and says, you're going to have to start trading with us or else we'll make you. We'll use our gunboats. And so faced with kind of this power of U.S. warship and these demands, and similar ones made by places like Britain, Japan agrees to open up, which is very different from China's initial reaction. Japan opens to trade. They are ready to industrialize. They had been keeping up through kind of their Dutch learning with what people had been doing in the rest of the world. And they had a group of people who are ready to take this on. Whereas in China, they tried to oppose the British for good reason. They didn't want opium being sold in their country, and they fight and end up losing wars to Great Britain because their self-imposed isolation had basically made this civilization, which had seen themselves as the most powerful in world history, it resulted in them falling behind. And so Britain comes in with their steamships and their gigantic gunboats and their modernized military, and they're able to defeat China. Japan doesn't have to face that because they, for lack of better words, cooperate and say basically, we will trade with you. The only thing you have to do is just teach us how to do this industrialization thing. And they both, in both cases, we see reforms develop. China does realize that they have to modernize, and they do so through this thing called the self-strengthening movement, which has some moderate successes, but really is developed this way for the government to face internal and external problems. They begin to develop modern technologies. They get help from the British and French to try to build a modern military. But ultimately, there was too much going on in China. There's a rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, that comes about, which just completely weakens the government almost permanently. And then in Japan, we have a very different set of reforms that are much more successful. We have what's called the Meiji Restoration, where the Tokugawa shogunate comes to an end and the emperor is restored to power. There are government reforms, which sets up a parliament that can advise, but not really make any decisions, but it advises what are called these Meiji oligarchs, these powerful owners or captains of industry, if you want to call them, who are advisors to the emperor. And Japan also continues to sponsor industrialization. You heard about that last week, Russia and Japan, and state-sponsored industrialization. So what is the result of this imperialism for China and Japan? Ultimately, China is dominated by Europe. They have to sign a series of unequal treaties where European countries develop spheres of influences, and the United States too. Don't want to forget them. They deal with rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion is absolutely devastating for China, and it's eventually followed up by something called the Boxer Rebellion, which actually fights against foreign influence in China, is actually supported by the government, but is put down by combination forces from Britain and France, and ultimately is a major embarrassment for the Qing government in China. So that government permanently weakens, and it won't take very long into our next time period for that government to collapse in favor of a new nationalist government. Well, the outcome for Japan is vastly different. They modernize their industry, they modernize their economy, they trade with the West. Japan even wins a couple major wars in defeating China in a war, which is really kind of turns the world upside down in a sense in East Asia, because Japan had always kind of been the little brother to China. And in this case, we see Japan had clearly overtaken them and established their own influence in China. They also defeat Russia in a war. The Russo-Japanese War goes Japan's way, and they simply put become an imperial power themselves. As they industrialize, being an island nation, they also need resources, raw materials, markets, and they will do pretty much what the rest of Europe does. So successful, in fact, that they sign an equal treaty with Britain to be seen as a peer. So this is one of the major comparisons in this unit. So make sure that you at least understand the basics of these. I know there are a lot of terms in here, typing rebellion, Boxer rebellion, self-strengthening movement, that I didn't have time to go into a ton of depth on, but at least it's a starter. All right, other things that we see as a result of imperialism: states expand. Even the United States will get into this with expansion, not just westward, right? That idea of manifest destiny that was claimed by the United States as a precursor to take over indigenous lands of the West, but also the United States starts to establish an empire in the Pacific following the annexation of Hawaii, as well as winning the Spanish-American War in 1898, making Cuba a protectorate, taking over Puerto Rico, taking over the Philippines, which the United States then has to put down a rebellion to maintain control of. So the US gets in on this. Russia, same thing. Russia expands eastward to the Pacific, ultimately taking over Alaska, which they then sell to the United States. But Russia competes with Britain even for influences in Central Asia. It's something you may see come up a little bit later. And then lastly, as I just talked about, Japan begins their own expansion in this time period. That is not to say, as we go through all of this, this kind of goes back to that question earlier, there is resistance to imperialism, right? All these regions of the world that are being taken over are not being taken over and just rolling over and not doing anything about it. One example of this, Cherokee Nation of the United States, in the 1820s and 30s, there's a movement to push Native Americans west. The Trail of Tears ensues, but the Cherokee Nation basically puts up a fight against the United States government, eventually signing a treaty to maintain control of some of their lands. In South Africa, the Zulu kingdom fights wars with Britain, the first actually very successfully against Britain, who was not prepared for the fighting styles of the Zulu. These Zulu warriors, which you see there in the bottom right, they eventually are defeated by the British and subjugated in the British colony. Outside of something we haven't really talked about yet in this presentation, in the Ottoman Empire, remember they're an empire, so they're imperial as well. They start to lose control of Balkan states, places like Bulgaria, Greece, who wins a war for independence. And that's going to set up our path to World War I in the next unit, as the Balkans are seen as that powder keg of World War I. And then lastly, the one we've talked about before, and that is the Indian Rebellion of 1857, where those sepoy soldiers of the British East India Company fight back against British rule. So that is key concept 5.2 as quickly as I could do it in about 45 minutes after my 5 minutes of introduction. So I'm pretty proud of myself, but I promised you a Kahoot. So that is what we are going to do next. If you would, and you want to participate in this Kahoot, go ahead and navigate to kahoot.it, and I'm going to adjust my screen so we can control, so we can take a look at what we're doing. All right. There is a question in the chat that says, what does it say underneath the Zulu kingdom? It's the Balkan states versus the Ottomans, the Balkan states. So I'm going to type that in the chat for you. All right. Let's see if I can change where we are focusing here. This is really testing my knowledge of how to use this. All right. Okay, let's cancel this. I'm pressing the wrong thing, so I need to change up my screen. All right, we're going to share our Kahoot window. Somewhere in here, I will have this done right. All right. Thank you for being patient, guys, as I get this up and running. So we're going to do two-factor authentication here. So get ready. All right, there you go. So you have a pattern, and I think it lasts for about 7 seconds or so. So hopefully the delay is not too long, and you'll be able to sign into this. All right, players are joining. What great fun. The Kahoot tonight is made by Amanda, who's been doing an awesome job in these presentations. I hope they're very helpful for you. Take a moment to reiterate what she said last week, which is that for right now, we're using Kahoot, but pretty soon, Fiveable is going to launch an app where we can be doing this on our own. So that is one of the more exciting things I've seen. You got an email about submitting questions. Hopefully your teachers might offer you some extra credit. I'm giving mine some extra credit to submit questions as long as they are written by you. Remember, that's important. And yeah, we're getting excited about those possibilities. While people are signing in, I'm going to take a peek at these questions. One of the questions says, was there any difference in Indian, Chinese, and Japanese imperialism? How did Europe treat each territory? So there certainly was. India was direct government control under the British Raj. So Britain controls that region directly. In China, it was more so economic spheres of influence, where European countries had control over certain territories. And in some cases, when they deemed it necessary, they would make incursions into China. But Japan was a very different case, because while Europeans were strong enough to have Japan open up and they assisted Japan's industrialization, they did not have long-term control over Japan. In fact, in a matter of 50 years or so, Japan was on level with the rest of Europe. So good question. One question here about what are continuities in large-scale migrations during the time period of imperialism? Oh, there's a lot. That's key concept 5.4. But one thing that we see is that migration back and forth from parent countries to colonial territories and between colonial territories happens in this time period. Also, slavery comes to an end in this time period. And so there are labor migrations that are a major continuity in this time period. There was actually a really good LEQ about that not too long ago. All right. I think we got about as many players as we're going to get, I think. I don't know how. We're at about 29. So we're going to go ahead and get started on this Kahoot. There's 12 questions in it, so hopefully you are ready. All right. Leopold II ruled an African empire in this modern state with Hitler-level cruelty. Let's see what everybody has to say about this one. All right. I'm hopeful that I'm not blocking anyone in my, is my head, I hope my head is not, please move my head. I knew that was going to be the case. Yes. Luckily, it was the wrong answer. I also need to figure out how to move my head around this screen. So working on that now. Oh, that's not going to work. All right. Stay tuned and I will figure it out. All right, we're getting closer. Still not working. All right. I can put it at the top is what I'm being told. All right, guys, I used to be a young man where I knew how to do these electronic things. So I am making that attempt. Oh, I just made it really tiny. Is that good? Put a 1 in the chat if it works for you, if it's much better. All right. Hot dang. All right, good. All right, well, 13 of us got that one right. Excellent. Leopold II ruled in the modern-day Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is this Congo region, which had certainly a great deal of rubber. That was the main resource. Leopold II was the ruler of Belgium. So remember, South Africa was ruled first by the Dutch and then by the British. All right, M in the lead. Look at you. Which event led the British to direct control over India? All right, pretty good here. Correct answer, Indian Rebellion of 1857 is correct. Remember that Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Rebellion, is the catalyst for Britain taking control, the Crown taking control from what had been ruling India, which was the British East India Company, which was just a corporation with government power. They can make treaties, they can make war. It's pretty scary stuff. And that leads to their control over India. The Berlin Conference, remember, is all about the scramble for Africa. That's the connection we want to make there. All right, new leader and new question. All the following were causes of the new imperialism, except what answer? All right, we did very well there. So, right, all of these were causes except the expansion of slavery. Remember, slavery comes to an end in this time period. Increased nationalism fits, the need for raw materials, and new technologies. For some of you who may have chosen that, may not have connected it to the Industrial Revolution. So keep that in mind. All right, good job. Akhilesh, still in the lead. Hope I said that right. Otherwise, my apologies. Next question. What was the purpose of the Berlin Conference? We just talked about this. Let's see how you do. All right. Hey, 25 of us got it correct. Hopefully the others may have just picked the wrong thing. Berlin Conference, yes, was to divide Africa up between European powers. It was not a realignment of European alliances, more so than it was an attempt to maintain a balance of power. So the Berlin Conference wasn't seeking to change up who was allied with whom, but just to keep those sides kind of put in place. So excellent job. Nobody was tricked by the put a check on Leopold II. So nice job with that. Looking really good. All right. Same leader, but very close game. Next question. Which Chinese dynasty was in power during the Opium Wars? Another one that we dealt with tonight. All right, and did very well again. The Qing dynasty, very good. The Qing dynasty, otherwise known as the Manchu, are in power. They're the last dynasty of China. And next we'll see kind of the traditional imperial Chinese government collapse in favor of a new nationalist government, and then eventually communist China. And as you may have seen in the chat, someone from the leaderboard will be chosen randomly at the end of the game for a 5+ membership. So good luck, everybody. And M has reclaimed the lead. All right, Matthew Perry, not the star of Friends, but Matthew C. Perry, opened up trade with which Asian country? I would like to say that these questions were developed independently of my preparation. So I think if you know this key concept, you're going to be pretty on track for getting lots of these questions right. And that is correct. 22 of us got it correct. Japan. Yeah, Matthew Perry, the American Commodore, the leader of the American fleet that arrives at the door of Japan and says, open up, stop being closed. If you ever need an extra video to help you out, the History of Japan video, I wholeheartedly approve. All right, question number 7, over halfway there. The man in this image represents which imperialist? Ooh, somebody I did not talk about, but I certainly can in just a moment. All right. Ooh, we definitely had a hard one. That's going to separate us out, I think. We don't have Leopold here, but let's take a look at this image. This is of a guy named Cecil Rhodes. And Cecil Rhodes was a British imperialist. If you ever have a chance to read some stuff by Cecil Rhodes, you should. It is fascinating and completely nuts. But Cecil Rhodes was an important British imperialist. He was responsible for basically gaining a monopoly over diamond mines in South Africa with the De Beers Corporation, a company that had a monopoly on diamonds until the year basically 2000, I think, something around there. But he starts the De Beers Corporation and becomes incredibly rich. Also, very noteworthy British diplomat who is encourages further colonization of Africa. In fact, the region called Rhodesia is named for him, or was named for him. Now it's Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Botswana, I believe. And in this image, what we have here is this imperialist Cecil Rhodes stringing telegraph wires across the continent of Africa, from Cairo in the north to Cape Town, or to South Africa on the southern part of the continent, showing British domination. So something I think that is definitely noteworthy. Cecil Rhodes, among other things, was very much one of those imperialists who believed in social Darwinism, ideas of cultural superiority of the British. He wanted Anglo-Saxon, that is British, white British people, to populate the world. And he even had some kind of wild ideas about taking back over the United States to make that happen. So really out there guy, but important historical figure to keep in mind. And M still in the lead. Lynn, though, making a jump up to second place. And let's move on to question 8. The Great Game refers to the race between Russia and Great Britain to control which region? This is one I alluded to earlier. Oh no, somebody asked, when does this end? Well, we'll end, usually we shoot for about an hour, but we're going to end at the end of this Kahoot game. So probably not much longer. So this is what I alluded to about Russia's incursions into Central Asia and how they fought with Britain for control over certain regions and influence in certain regions. And so Central Asia is the correct answer here, with what's called the Great Game. All right, Lynn has jumped into the lead. Congratulations, but we still have 4 questions left. Which is the most accurate cause of the mistreatment of Africans as seen in this image? If you can't read the caption there, it says, in the rubber coils. Yeah, and that's the giveaway there, right? So Europeans' desire for raw materials such as rubber in the Congo. Here's that image once again, right? This idea of the British imperialist, the snake, taking over this African because of the desire for those raw materials. All right, Lynn cracked 10,000, answer streak of 9. Hasn't missed one yet. Here's question 10. Which war led to the U.S. occupation of Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines? All right, and that is the Spanish-American War. Very good. So this war also makes kind of a hero of Teddy Roosevelt, right? The Rough Riders down in Cuba, I believe. So the Spanish-American War, this is the war that really has the United States enter onto the imperial scene, and also continues to signal, I guess, it's another example of Spain losing power in the West. All right, Lynn still in the lead. Question 11, 2 to go. Which imperialist colony pair is correct? This one's tough. You got to think a little bit more carefully here. I would say this is the closest to a trick question you're going to get. And correct answer here is the Netherlands and South Africa. And so whereas France takes over Vietnam, and well, Germany and Poland doesn't fit with this era. Japan and Hawaii doesn't fit with this era. The Netherlands and South Africa. Remember, before South Africa is a British colony, it is a Dutch colony, and the Dutch live in the Netherlands. So good job for the 15 of you that got that question correct. Lynn is in the lead, followed by Akhilesh, and then Ashley, M, and Jalia. And we have one question to go. What percent of Africa was colonized before 1880? Ooh, this is something I definitely did not cover. Let's see what you can get. So before 1880. Remember, after about 1900, there's only a couple places that are not colonized. Correct answer, 10%. About 10% of Africa colonized before 1880. It included Egypt, it included South Africa, but not much more than that was colonized before 1880. So we get as a podium here, and Lynn, 12 out of 12, finishes in first place, followed by Ashley, 11 out of 12, and M with 10 out of 12. So that is your podium for today. I'm going to try to turn back on my camera. I'm going to leave the podium up for a little bit. Congratulations to Lynn on winning this game. Congratulations also to Ashley and M, who I think got as many questions as I probably would have on this. I think I would have probably been tricked by the Netherlands question. So that is our presentation for tonight. That is what we're dealing with, imperialism. If you have any other questions about this, certainly do not hesitate to send a message or ask Dylan. I think Dylan might be running next week. I've enjoyed being with you here tonight. I'm very much enjoying not going the hour and 40 minutes or whatever I went a few weeks ago. So with that said, I hope that you learned a little bit of something about imperialism. I was very impressed with your knowledge in the review game on Kahoot. And have a great day at school tomorrow, everybody. Hope that you have a good time, and hope you do really well in your exam. I'll be back with you later on. That's it. Now I just got to figure out how to turn off this screen, which might be more difficult than it looks.